do you think this means then for relations with China and the US right now? There's a lot to be gained for China to have good relations with Myanmar for their Belt and Road Initiative. What do you think is going to happen on those fronts in the future?
Well, China remains the biggest trading partner for Myanmar by far. That's not going to change. And there are rumors, of course, that the military generals have large bank accounts in China. So that relationship isn't going to fundamentally change. I think China would probably prefer that there not be turmoil on its doorstep, as it generally has a rather conservative kind of foreign policy in that respect. But they have invested heavily in the country. It is a strategic hotspot. They are pursuing pipelines. They already have a pipeline from the Bay of Bengal to southwestern China. And they're hoping to circumvent the U.S. strategic stranglehold on the Straits of Malacca as a trading route and point of shipping oil and other products. So if they can have another route to the Indian Ocean, that would be tremendously valuable to China. But they're playing the long game. Burma's not going anywhere, and neither is China. So their interests there are in the long term. And those, I think, are relatively unaffected by what's happening now, even though in the short term, China is probably concerned about the disruption this will cause to their interests in Burma. But for the U.S., we're not a major trading partner there. The main interest seems to be to stymie or limit the advance of China's interests in the region and in that country for those geostrategic reasons I mentioned. Biden has already indicated that he's supportive of sanctions being reimposed on the country, which were controversial at the time. Before they were lifted, a sort of emerging consensus among Burma watchers was that the sanctions were more harmful than effective. Remains a point of controversy, but it looks like we're headed towards what are called targeted sanctions that will probably focus on the military's business interests, but it's unclear exactly how effective that would be, given that many of the links financially are not with the U.S. to begin with. And it seems very unlikely that the U.S. is going to, say, lean on Singaporean banks to freeze bank accounts, which would be unnerving indeed for the generals, but is frankly not going to happen.
I mean, the thing with sanctions generally is as targeted as they might be claimed to be when these quote unquote targeted figures have power and interest throughout the economy. These sanctions inevitably end up harming average people,
right?
Because these sanctions can be interpreted in various broad ways. I mean, we might say that this sanction is just against this one leader, but then when that leader has kind of control of certain economic interests, that can prevent global banks, global firms from doing any kind of business with a large portion of kind of your elements of the economy, or if they do, there is a risk fee that the company has to pay. And it's, I mean, liberal interventionists, I think, like to think that sanctions are a gentler, kinder way to do intervention in other countries, but ultimately they're not.
And the U.S. is not going to say, we're going to support workers' unions and try to democratize enterprise in the country, right? They're not going to pursue anything like that. They're going to try to maintain the capitalist system, but effectively say, okay, well, we're just going to freeze you out or try to make it more expensive for you to participate in global capital systems. But what this last bit of these last 10 years or so, when global capital rushed in a gold rush sort of mindset I remember when I first moved there, it was still the very tail end of the quote unquote battle, and it was a very different place. The SIM cards were $2,500. Now it's $1 per SIM card, and mobile phone usage has skyrocketed. Facebook has become a national pastime and the main means of communication across the country. At one point, when they had shut down Messenger, a friend with good connections to the government joked that they had to lift the ban on Messenger because they can't run the government without it. So it's changed drastically. But what you've got essentially are huge capital investments in the country in terms of manufacturing, extraction, and so on, that the military would be happy to seize as their own and to continue to operate. Certain companies are making noise that they're going to now not finish building factories or close certain factories, but there's been infrastructure certainly built across the country, so telecommunications towers built across the country by private capital that are ripe for the military to seize if they so please. So there was a kind of premature, at the time, there were a small number of folks, myself included, who were decrying this kind of gold rush mentality. The carpetbaggers, however, obviously felt that more capitalism would entrench democratic gains. But of course, we understand that capitalism and democracy are fundamentally incompatible. And, the result is essentially the military was able to buy a raft of new weapons on markets that they had been previously excluded from Israel, from Russia, from other places. And they were able to effectively avoid a financial crisis that they had been staring at, where they weren't going to be able to meet their pension obligations to their base, effectively, the civil servant class and sort of petty bourgeois class, who lots of folks have family. If you go to the middle of the country, almost every family has someone who's connected to or in the army. So they avoided that by effectively capitulating to demands for quote unquote democracy, released Aung San Suu Kyi from prison, set up this parliament, and so on and so forth. And then it was fine then, with that underway, people could point to, oh, well, it's in process. They opened the door to global capital come in under the guise of, oh, well, it's democracy in progress, so it's fine. Which is always foolish.
There tends to be the self-serving narrative that free market capitalism inevitably leads towards a greater move towards liberal democracy. And I mean, this was what was said in China during the opening up of China when Western capital flowed into China. I mean, really, it's just a self-serving narrative. Western capital would prefer to do business in places like Myanmar without pesky like activists and people pointing out the human rights record and making it kind of awkward for Western capital to make their money there and to exploit the cheap labor and all the rest of it. I mean, underneath it all, there's kind of this rivalry between great powers. I was reading this kind of alleged opening up happened under Obama and this kind of the famous pivot to Asia. Obama wanted a greater role for the West in the United States in Myanmar, an effort to kind of crowd out China in the region and maybe ultimately prevent China from having as much of an ally there. It's just some of the, we were looking at that BBC article. There is kind of this narrative that China is applauding these anti-democratic, anti-human rights move. Really, it's just they rejected this motion in the United Nations, calling this an internal issue for Myanmar. Really, just because that's what they say anytime a situation like this comes up. They say it's an internal issue. They don't like the idea of foreign powers kind of intervening in any way within a country because it's China and Russia both, because this tends to be sometimes a prelude to the West getting involved in other ways.
Right, and Thailand echoed that sentiment of, oh, this is an internal issue, because of course that country is led by the former head of the military that staged a coup 6 years ago. Thailand has had, I think, on the order of 20 coups at this point. I've kind of lost track. So the generals in Myanmar watch that very closely. And so I think what they're trying to do is follow the Thai model for a coup, seize power, you promise elections, and you hope that business keeps moving ahead, even if it takes a little bit of a hit. And the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which Burma is a member, released some mealy-mouthed statements, and their whole line is non-interference in domestic issues as well. So there isn't going to be any real pressure from China or regional neighbors against the military. And of course, the military has an argument that they're making. Of course, it's premised on this completely implausible claim of voter fraud. It's their rigged game. It was always rigged. They're operating. All they have to do is invoke this sense of, oh, there's a crisis, there's a threat to national security, and voila, now they're able to invoke and say it's constitutional. I'm sure people will be analyzing the specifics of its constitutionality and legality under Myanmar law, but at any rate, they obviously have set this up in such a way that they can rely on those claims and point to the Constitution and the law and say what we're doing is entirely legal and is not a coup. It's a cabinet reshuffle. It's a national emergency and so on.
They're calling this a year-long national emergency state for now. I mean, there's always a lot of attention paid to the framing of these things and for the sake of selling them to the international community and trying to keep business flowing as smoothly as they can. It seems that, this received a little bit of coverage in Western media. At the end of the day, it's not something that is going to have huge ramifications for Western foreign policy interests. And I mean, there's no Burmese expat community in the United States. I mean, the way there is with some Latin American countries in Miami. So there's no internal kind of push within the United States for something to be done one way or the other as relates to Burma.
Right, there's a small community, but they don't say have an outsized role in a key election state.
Yeah. There's not going to be a lot of jockeying for Burmese voters in the next election that Biden's going to be concerned about.
Not at all.